welcome and hope yours and you are safe. I know these are tough times. I don't know how many of you are in New York, but I take heart in the solidarity and compassion we've witnessed over these last few weeks. Last night, as has happened these last weeks in New York City, thousands of New Yorkers gathered on their balconies to show their, in the street corners to show their gratitude for the healthcare workers, the first responders, who are risking their lives to save ours. And the clapping and the cheering resounded through the city. This pandemic, and I think we'll hear it from Elie in different ways, has exposed so many weaknesses, not only in our medical system, but our political, economic, judicial systems. It's also, as I said, generated a profound sense of solidarity. And that spirit is really important, it seems, as we think toward how we're going to emerge from this. It seems hard to do right now. I do believe, Sarah mentioned this, that a free, independent press is critical to see us through these times, to watchdog, to report the truth, campaign for justice, and bring you in-depth analysis and coverage of the coronavirus crisis, but also the state of our politics, our democracy, the health of our planet. As you may know, we've put all of our coronavirus coverage in front of our paywall. It's met with great reception and readership. But these are times for bold solutions and bold ideas. Some of you may have heard that Bernie Sanders just suspended his campaign. We'll learn as to why that was. John Nichols' interview with Bernie Sanders posted at our site yesterday, I think, gave a sense of what was coming, that Sanders was thinking hard about the cost of continuing and alternative ways of bringing his big ideas, bold ideas to the landscape. So we'll hear about that. This is the second of our nation virtual breakfasts. We're honored to have Elie Mystal. I wanted to say that next week, Pramila Jayapal, Representative Jayapal of Washington State, will join us. We hope to have Reverend Barber the following week. But let me introduce our guest today. We couldn't have a better guest, though it's not the best of circumstances, but what we just saw in Wisconsin yesterday was a playbook for voter suppression, which may well, though we will fight it, define this election. What the court did, as Elie wrote in an article at the top of our site yesterday, Trump won't steal the election, but your government might. And in it, he tried to allay readers' fears that Trump will use the coronavirus to cancel the 2020 election and instead warn them to pay attention to the way states might use the crisis to sway the election. And this past Monday, less than 3 weeks later, the Supreme Court seemed to vindicate Elie's warning when it blocked Wisconsin from extending the absentee ballot deadline for its primary. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent said very clearly, this will disenfranchise thousands of voters, thousands of voters. It was like Bush v. Gore 2.0, terrifying proof of Elie's concept. And it shows that the Republican Supreme Court won't stop Republican local officials from disenfranchising people or using coronavirus as a kind of weapon, weaponizing it. So Elie is prescient, fueled by righteous outrage, unwilling to give in to defeat. And this is what I love, and we love at The Nation, about what distinguishes Elie's voice in this time. More than 3 years into the Trump administration and in the middle of this grim pandemic, Elie refuses to become inured or exhausted and insists always on prodding us to action. And this is true whether he's writing about the far-right judiciary and the takeover of the judiciary, the legacy of the Central Park Five, or the impeachment process. Remember that? So Elie is our justice correspondent. That's been the case since January. He writes the column Objection. And prior to joining us, Elie served as executive editor of the legal news site Above the Law. He did several years as a litigator at Du Bois Plimpton, graduate of Harvard Law School, Harvard College. And he's a frequent guest on MSNBC, Sirius Radio. And we're very grateful he's taken time on his wife's birthday, which he had hoped to celebrate as a quiet day without living on Twitter as Elie does, or Zoom as he's going to do with us for an hour. So thank you, Elie. Elie, we'll talk for maybe 10, 12 minutes and we'll open it up to you. But we're very, very grateful. And welcome to all of you for this second virtual breakfast meeting.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I wish you hadn't mentioned the Harvard Law thing. That's not a, it's not a thing I'm proud of these days. given what's coming out of that school. Thank you all so much for joining us. These are difficult times, and we really appreciate your support, and I appreciate you caring about the kinds of issues that I want to talk about today. I want to start with talking about, as Katrina mentioned, what happened in Wisconsin. Look, I am not a doctor. I am not a public health official. I cannot tell anybody anything relevant about how to stay safe and how to stay healthy and how to plan a city or a nation through a global infectious disease pandemic. I went to law school. I didn't pass Orgo in college. What I do know is that despite everything I just said, despite the pandemic, despite the deaths, despite the fear, the Republican Supreme Court will not stop. The Republicans will not stop trying to steal the election, steal rights, and crush those less fortunate just because there's a crisis going on. In fact, it's the opposite. They see the crisis as an opportunity to take advantage of our distraction. And so all I can offer right now is keeping an eye on what they're trying to do and how devastatingly effective they are. And that's what we saw in Wisconsin yesterday. It's weird because it's one of those things where you don't want to get too dragged down into the weeds to miss the larger point. But the weeds are slightly important here. The key issue in Wisconsin was that for various reasons that we don't have to go into, the state decided to go forward with its primary election on Tuesday. The Democratic governor didn't want to. The Republican-controlled state legislator didn't want to. Fight, fight, fight. The Republican-controlled Wisconsin Supreme Court forced the state to go forward with its election on Tuesday. While all of that was happening, the Democratic National Committee sued the Republican National Committee, asking for what I would argue was a very simple accommodation. Given that we are in this pandemic, we are in social distancing, we are in, either self-quarantine or enforced quarantine in some places, there are a lot of people who wanted to vote, who realized that they would not or should not vote in person. By the way, Wisconsin also, I think in Milwaukee, usually has 180 polling places, shrunk down to 5. So people realized they were going to have to vote from home, and so they wanted to request absentee ballots. A lot of these people didn't realize, kind of weeks ago that they would need them, and so the Democratic National Committee asked for a simple extension of the date by which you could request an absentee ballot and the date by which you could turn in an absentee ballot. They sued the Republican National Committee. It went to court. The district court in Wisconsin, that's the kind of trial court for the federal system, said, yeah, that makes sense. We should extend the deadline to request them. We should extend the deadline that the state has to receive them. And, slightly new, we're going to actually extend the deadline for when you can mail the ballot back. The Democratic National Committee had only asked to extend the deadline of when you would receive so like if you sent your ballot in on Tuesday and the state didn't get it till Friday.
Mike?
Nobody can hear me.
Now we can. Yeah.
I've muted myself somehow.
Oh, okay, good. Okay.
All right.
Good.
Good. Okay. So I'll start back before. So all the DNC asked was to extend the deadline for when the state had to receive the ballots. The district court said wisely that actually you could send in your ballots after election day, because the district court found that, not everybody would have a ballot by election day. Now, this is such a simple core idea in a democratic nation. You should have the opportunity to vote, and you can't vote if you don't have a ballot. So the district court said, if you don't get your ballot by Tuesday, April 7th, and you get it on Wednesday, April 8th, you can fill out your ballot and send it in, and the state still has to accept your vote. Simple extension given the circumstances. Well, as you can imagine, Republicans didn't want any part of that, so they sued. It was appealed to the Seventh Circuit. The Seventh Circuit was like, Republicans, get out of my courtroom. But the Republicans were always just trying to get to the Supreme Court, where there were 5 conservative justices, waiting for them. And what happened on Monday night at 7:15, hours before the election was to start, was that the 5 conservative justices said that Wisconsin's extension of the deadline to mail back your ballot was illegal, and forced the state to only accept ballots that were postmarked by April 7th. Now, the Supreme Court tries to say that this was a narrow technical decision, but in actuality, what they did was ignore the arguments made by the DNC, by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by lots of progressive groups, that people weren't going to have their ballots by the 7th. Right? So the Supreme Court says, like, oh, it's usual for people to only receive their ballots on election day. Wisconsin is in no different situation than many absentee voters are, while ignoring the fact that there were people who were physically not going to have their ballots by election day, and thus not be able to effectively vote in the election. That is the core of the Supreme Court's ruling. Now, why is that terrible? Well, assuming for a second that I already have you on the idea that, like, people should be allowed to vote. If you don't believe that people should be allowed to vote, like, I understand that means you're a Republican, but, like, I don't got anything for you, right? If you don't fundamentally agree with the concept that people should be allowed to vote, then I can't convince you. But assuming that I do have you, and assuming that you do agree that people should be allowed to vote, the reason why what happened in Wisconsin is so dangerous is not just because of Wisconsin. I mean, look, I love Wisconsin. I like cheese. It's a great place. But fundamentally, do I care that a primary election that in a primary that was relatively already decided was tampered with by Republicans in Wisconsin? Mainly the Wisconsin Republicans were trying to hold on to a state Supreme Court seat that's Republican. They have a very small majority on the state Supreme Court, and they wanted to hold on to that seat. And that's, terrible Republican machinations, but, like, do I really care about that? No. What I care about is exactly what Katrina said. This is the playbook for how Republicans will steal the election nationally. It proceeds in 2 parts. Part 1, use coronavirus to suppress the vote. There are 2 things that Republicans know. 1, their voters believe that coronavirus is a hoax. Their idiot voters believe that coronavirus is a hoax, and their idiot voters are much more likely to go out to bars, to go out to restaurants, and certainly to go to the polling places. They're not going to be practicing social distancing. We understand that because of what Fox News has done to that base, they think this is all made up scare tactics, right? Republicans at the highest levels understand that, and they understand also that Democrats are smarter, that Democrats believe things like the CDC and the World Health Organization, that we, being, literate people, are rightly afraid of being out in public and being in large groups and being within 6 feet of people. They understand that we naturally will kind of suppress our own in-person voting. So they understand that. They also understand that in order to manage the fact that we are not going to be voting in person, the Democrats are going to be requesting a lot of absentee ballots. Okay, so how do you suppress the vote if everybody requests absentee ballots? Well, just because I request an absentee ballot doesn't mean you have to send me one, does it? You're supposed to, but what's happening, and what we already saw in Wisconsin, was that in low population counties, which tend to lean Republican, rural, blah, 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 there are 1,500 reasons why that is. It's relatively easy. If you if you go from 50 absentee ballot requests to 100 absentee ballot requests in a county of, in this fictitious county of 100 people, it's not that big of a deal. You need to print out 50 more pages. If you go from 200,000 absentee ballot requests to 1.1 million absentee ballot requests, that'll overwhelm your damn system. And what we saw in Wisconsin was that low population rural counties were getting their absentee ballots, while high population Democratic counties like, I don't know, Milwaukee, were not getting their absentee ballots. Now, which way do you think Milwaukee votes versus which way do you think rural Wisconsin votes, right? If you can suppress the amount, if Democratic voters are gonna self-suppress, are gonna self-quarantine because we read the news, if you can limit their ability to get an absentee ballot, then you effectively disenfranchise the voter who is too, again, smart to go out in person and vote. The Supreme Court, by its ruling in Wisconsin, basically says that these kinds of shenanigans are going to be okay. That as long as the Republican state officials can pretend that they tried to get absentee ballots to everybody, the Supreme Court is going to pretend that they were effective. And that actual facts on the ground, we had, again, the district court in our system is the finder of fact. The actual facts on the ground showed that not everybody had their ballots. But the Supreme Court said that they will not care what those facts are if the Republicans make a colorable claim that they tried their hardest. And that's how you steal the election. That's how you steal the election in Florida. That's how you steal the election in Ohio. That's how you steal the election in Michigan. And that's certainly how you steal the election in Wisconsin. The blue states are going to be fine. Donald Trump is not winning California. Okay, Donald Trump is not winning Massachusetts. But in these states where things are closer, in these states that break down because of gerrymandering, that break down county by county, Democrat versus Republican, battleground states like Pennsylvania, the upper Midwest, Florida, Texas, to the extent that Texas is in play this cycle, Georgia, to the extent that Georgia is in play this cycle. It is in these states where if you keep Democrats from having access to the ballot, you effectively shunt the election towards Donald Trump, right? That's one aspect. The other aspect here that I haven't, we're among friends. So I haven't done all of the research necessary to show this, but it seems pretty clear right now that the coronavirus is over affecting the African-American community. There are various reasons for that. Poverty plays a role, access to healthcare plays a role, lots of things play a role in that. But there are stats now coming out that shows that African Americans are disproportionately getting sick and disproportionately dying from the disease. Well, folks, African Americans are the base of the Democratic Party. And so if you have a sickness, if you have an infection, if you have a disease that is disproportionately affecting African American people, then what you also have is a disease that is disproportionately affecting Democratic voters. The entire theory of the Democrats' case, whether it was Bernie Sanders making it, or Joe Biden making it, or Elizabeth Warren, or Kamala Harris, the entire theory of the Democratic case has been turned out. That the way that we're going to beat Trump, the way we're going to overthrow this administration is the blue wave. We're going to get where's the turnout supposed to come from? It's supposed to come from the cities and the close suburbs. The cities and the close suburbs, which just at the moment are being hit hardest by coronavirus because that's where all the people are gathering together and the virus is jumping from you. So when you have a situation where a poor public health response disproportionately affects some people and not others, what we're seeing is that those disproportionate effects hit African-American communities, hit people in cities, hit people in the city's close suburbs. Those are all Democratic voters. So their incompetence, while it seems apolitical, right? There's a farcical, evil lack of empathy or knowledge permeating throughout the administration that doesn't seem political in nature, it seems just dumb in nature. Well, that incompetence also has a very political and very dangerous effect on our election. And again, the Supreme Court just said that that was okay. So I care about that. I think that is an extremely important part of this pandemic, and I don't see what there is to do about that. There are other issues that are happening that I do see a way that we could be doing better. One of the ways I want to definitely talk about before my time is up is the way that the Republicans are using coronavirus to expand racism, expand bigotry, and expand sexism, because we can do something about those things. If you'll notice in my writing, I do not use any of Trump's or Mike Pompeo's nicknames for the virus. I call it coronavirus, or I call it COVID. There was one time I was calling it the boomer plague, but that was just for fun. That was before I realized that young people actually were stupid enough to think they couldn't get it. I do not use Trump or Pompeo's racist, bigoted nicknames. Everybody in the media could be like me. There is absolutely no reason to rebroadcast and republish and recontour Trump's racist nicknames for this virus. And we know that his using of the racist nicknames for this virus is having a deleterious effect on the Asian American community in this country. People are getting beat up on the subway. People are getting sprayed with Febreze, to say nothing of what's happening to the actual like Chinese American service industry, where people are like not eating at Chinese restaurants and all this kind of useless stuff. We know that words have power, and there is no good reason to simply repeat Trump's words as if you're his sock puppet and he has his finger up your backside, right? There's no reason to do it. Just don't say it, right? Just execute some intellectual discipline and call the virus by its scientific name, not by Trump's nickname. That's on the racism, the bigotry coming out of this administration. The other thing that's happening is his Fusillade attack on women's rights. As many of you have seen, I'm sure, in Ohio, Iowa, Alabama, and Texas, sorry. All the governors there have decided that abortion is elective surgery, and they have banned abortions from taking place in their states under the guise of needing medical equipment to fight the coronavirus. We know this is a farce. We know this is a crap answer. We have seen New York and California, two states hardest hit by coronavirus. They haven't had to close down abortion clinics. Why? Because it's stupid. It's to think that a few people getting abortions is actually what's needed to solve our disgusting lack of sanitary medical supplies. That's just a dumb argument. Obviously, Republicans are trying to never let a good crisis go to waste. And again, yesterday, the Fifth Circuit, the circuit that governs Texas, said that was okay. If you look at what Republicans have said at the court level, what they've basically done is say that coronavirus is not an excuse to extend the voting deadline by one day, but it is an excuse to ban all abortions in your state if you are a Republican. That's wrong, that's gross, that's terrible. When I say that is also something that we can do something about, this is the kind of thing where I do think publicity matters, where I do think people talking about this, people emailing and calling their state representatives and their congresspeople would actually matter. By the way, you're on quarantine, what else you gotta do? Pick up the phone and call one of these elected officials and tell them that banning abortions in your state is not something that you would like to see. Because what we see time and time again is that a woman's right to choose, a basic right to choose, is a wildly popular idea. Right? We can get into some weeds once we get to 29 weeks and blah, blah, blah. That a woman should be able to take a pill of her own choice and do what she deems is best for herself and her body and her family. That is a wildly popular idea. And if we remind our representatives that is a wildly popular idea, then these Republicans who are trying to ban abortions through the back door in secret will not be able to do it in secret, and that alone should should slow their roll on the abortion issue, right? Because what they're trying to do is so brazen, and what the courts will allow them to do is so brazen, that actually just retarding the speed at which they go and attack women's rights is something that I think popular will and popular support and flooding the phone lines can actually accomplish. I think that we have actually, it's weird, I actually think we have more chance to slow the Republican roll on the abortion issue than we do on the election issue, because the Republicans know that if they let everybody vote, they just lose, right? I mean, Trump literally said that if everybody voted, Republicans would never win an election. We can't have that. Even Trump, who doesn't know much, knows that. So I don't actually think there's a lot we can do to make Republicans stop trying to steal the election. They want power. But trying to retard the progress at which they're making, attacking women's rights is something that we can do. And certainly trying to slow the metastasization of the administration's bigotry is something that we can do through collective action.
Elie, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you're reminding us of what's at stake, voting rights under attack, women's rights under attack, racial justice under attack, and what we can do, and why it's important that it not be done in darkness, and why we need to speak and write. I see that there are a lot of good questions from our participants, so I would love to turn it over to them because I say, and they have much to ask. So I will turn it over to Sarah or Erin to moderate, if I could. Thank you, Elie.
Sure. So Deborah Cooper asks a broad question. What can we do to ensure a robust and a legitimate election in November?
Yeah, so like I said, I think protecting our election is actually the hardest part, because Republicans want power and they know that stealing the election is their best way to get power. So I think our choices are limited. Again, I'm not a doctor, and so I don't have my usual stridentness when it comes to this issue. The Republicans might put us in a situation where we have to risk dying to go vote in person, or risk letting Trump have another 4 years. For me, that's an easy choice because I am relatively young and relatively healthy and relatively understanding of how dangerous Donald Trump is. I view Donald Trump as a bigger threat to my personal health than the coronavirus. That is not a decision that I can make for everybody. That is not going to be a decision that is true for everybody. So I don't want to have people in that position, but it might be a position that we find ourselves in. And if you, one of the only, I mean, I don't want to say the word hope because it never should happen, but when you look at how many Wisconsin voters actually did show up in person, you know, stories on Twitter about women who had to walk 30 minutes because the closest polling place was 30 minutes away and there were no buses running, and so she walked there. People standing out in the rain and the hail, people trying to keep 6 feet away from each other as they all went out in their masks and their garbage bags to try to vote these idiots out of power. That might be the kind of commitment that we all have to have in order to overthrow this administration. But it is a terrible choice that we shouldn't have to make, and I wouldn't lightly tell people to make it. Obviously, one only can hope that by November we're in a different place with the virus and it's a little bit easier to go out in public. But that might be what it takes.
So Carol Chalk is asking, you know, we're all isolated right now. So she's wondering what our effective actions can be taken in this moment to oppose our government's bad actions.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I've got 2 kids. I'm not isolated. I wish I could take them and isolate them in some other part of the country. But anyway, yes, our ability to gather and protest, for instance, is limited. But again, the phones still work, and there are still people taking calls. And I think especially in a situation where people don't have commuting times taking up their time and are kind of going stir crazy, bouncing off the walls with cabin fever, this is a great time to call your congressman. This is a great time to call your senator. This is a great time to call your state and local officials and tell them that at least that you're still watching, right? Because I think that's the other thing that happens sometimes, where sometimes when I write, I feel like I'm writing just to say like, hey, Republicans, y'all know I can still see you, right? Like there's an aspect where they think that nobody is noticing because everybody's, like just reminding our elected officials that we are watching and making a list and seeing which one of them are trying to help democracy and which ones of them are trying to steal it. Like that could also actually be useful. We gotta remember the representatives. Gotta remember that they're politicians. My dad used to be a local politician, and so I understand a little bit about how the politician's mind works. And one of the things that's really difficult for them right now is that they can't go out and see the people. Remember, a lot of these people are people who put their finger into the wind and try to figure out which way it's blowing, and they can't do their rallies. They can't do their meet and greets. They can't shake the hands on the rope lines. They're not getting an indication of how people feel about their job performance right now, right? So calling them and telling them, emailing them and telling them is actually going to be even, I think, more impactful than usual because they're not getting that thing that all politicians crave, the cheers and the joys and they're not hearing it, right? So use your phone, use your email, get on these people's nerves. That could actually help.
Stephen Manchester asks, and I think this is a good add-on, he points out that coronavirus will likely still be with us in November since we won't have a vaccine at that point. And so he's wondering if voters request the mail-in ballots at the earliest possible date, wouldn't that work to ensure that their votes could be counted? Sure.
I've requested mine. But you also have to look. I think that's the smart, reasonable, protective answer. Are most people going to do that? No, because I mean, again, there are 15 different reasons, but people don't think that the virus is going to last till November. People aren't thinking to November. People are trying to think through Friday, right? They're trying to, like, most people are kind of like trying to figure out like where the next fresh direct order is coming from. My wife is staying up till 12:01 every night to try to for when the Fresh Direct website refreshes to see if there's an order slot open so we can get food. That's what most people are doing. Not like I got to get my absentee ballot request form in on. Like you also have to remember that in this country, most people don't even start paying attention to the presidential election until like August, September. People use like the conventions as like, oh, I gotta care about this now, right? If we even have a convention this year, I was supposed to go this year, right? Like, is that even happening? So people aren't going to even, the majority of people, and I know like here among friends in this Zoom chat, we all care. Most people don't care. Most people just don't care and won't start caring until like 2 weeks before. If we don't have a system where people can request an absentee ballot and receive it and vote 2 weeks before the election, 10 days before the election. If that's not the system, then a lot of people are going to be disenfranchised. And the argument, and again, I'm not a Republican, so the argument that, well, they just should have thought ahead is just not, I don't want to hear that, right? I'm not here for telling people to think ahead to exercise one of the most basic rights in a democracy, right? Voting should be easy. And people should be able to figure out the day of that, hey, I should maybe vote today. Like, that's actually how it should work. And I would rather kind of spend all of my energy and fight trying to make it work like that as opposed to reminding people I don't even really know what day it is, but like reminding people in April that they should be requesting absentee ballots, even though I have myself done so.
So Emily Gallagher, putting the focus back on blue states, she's wondering if this election stealing that you've been talking about could have an impact on local elections. She points out that there are a lot of very progressive local officials in these states who were elected by very small margins.
Yep. I mean, to go back to Wisconsin, the reason why Wisconsin Republicans were so involved in trying to have an illegitimate election is not because they cared about the Joe Biden-Bernie Sanders primary. There was a state Supreme Court seat up, and that's what they cared about, and that's what they were going to the mattresses to defend. So yes, local elections, which already have low turnout, which already have people who are acting with less information, those are going to be as impacted by any kind of voter suppression, disenfranchisement, as anything else. As progressive candidates go, though, I think that might be okay. In these like blue states, I think they might be a little bit better situated because progressive candidates tend to have kind of a more rabid following than centrist candidates. I'm not making an opinion on who should have won the primary. I'm just saying that in general, progressive candidates tend to engender real kind of like movement. I'm going to walk through a wall to support that person, than more centrist, like, that guy seems credible and fine candidates, right? Like, you know, I do not live in her district, right? But if AOC wanted me to go swim somewhere to vote for her, like, I would do that, right? I would find a way to support my girl. That's what progressive candidates tend to inspire in people in a way that more reserved, distant centrists don't. So I do have at least some hope that in some of these tight local elections, progressive candidates will actually, benefit is not the word, but progressive candidates will hold their own simply because of the rabid support of the way that their base will show up for them. On the flip side, this is why Trump is president, right? Like his Trump supporters are the most rabid people that I've met in life. And so it is entirely likely that these, Trump people, they are going to go to the, 45% of the country is going to go to the mattresses to support their guy. It's too much. What Trump has done it's a cult, right? He's infused his own personality into their personalities. They've had to give up so much in order to support him. They've had to give up friends, families, the respect of their peers. They've had to give up so much to support him that they are now all in. Like they can't not have him be president. So they are going to show up to vote. And I worry a little bit about the Democratic base, which doesn't have that rabid, not all of us have that rabid feeling that he needs to be replaced. So I worry about that a little bit more nationally than I do locally.
Well, here's a question about moderates in our party and racism. So Ben Chan is asking, how do we convince moderate Democrats to really embrace an anti-racist and pro-racial justice platform when so many of them think that criticizing Trump's racism and is specifically calling out anti-Asian racism as a distraction. And he points out that it's causing a lot of fear, and the after effects of the fear it's causing are going to be with us for quite a while.
And if I had an answer, I'd run for something, right? Like, it is the problem of our times. It's weird. I actually think that, again, maybe it's because my dad was a politician. I have a somewhat low opinion of them, right? Like I have somewhat of a low kind of like, they are easily movable beasts, right? Who moves them? The media, the people, those are what moves these people, or can move these people. And so to the extent that I have voice and platform, I try to focus that pressure on the media more so than any individual politician, because if they start getting bad headlines, they'll change. Like that, in my experience, if politicians start getting bad headlines, they change. Bad headlines from places they like, Trump doesn't care if he gets bad headlines in the New York Times, but if he starts getting bad headlines in Breitbart, he'll change. And so for Democrats, if they start getting bad headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post, they will change. They will get that they can't play footsie with racists, that's not what we want them to do. But to do that, you have to get the New York Times to stop playing footsie with racists, right? You have to get the Washington Post to stop. That's the nut of it, but that's where I try to focus the energy. That's why I say if you think about it, I'm not really wasting a lot of breath being like, oh, Mike Pompeo, stop because he's Mike Pompeo. He's gonna be racist, he's gonna do what he's gonna do. Maggie Haberman doesn't have to report it, right? That's the actual problem. The Washington Post doesn't have to reprint the racist thing Mike Pompeo said just because Mike Pompeo said it. And if we can get them to understand that, if we can get MSNBC to stop playing Trump's pep rallies / coronavirus misinformation conferences, if we can get them to stop playing them live, to cut away from the lies, to fact check the lies in real time, if nothing else, then we can start to move the needle. And so I spent a lot of energy trying to be a voice for that project, and I waste less time on individual candidates because I do think that they are they're just trying to keep their jobs. And if it seems like it's easier to keep your job this way or that way, then that's the way they go. The core principle for so many of them is just I want my job, right? And so I can't. I know, Ben, I know you're talking about I can't make the guy you're talking about realize that racism is bad. I can't do it, but I feel like I can make the media realize that racism is bad. And if the media realizes that racism is bad, maybe the guy you're talking about will too.
Here's a question about incompetent judges being put on the bench. Miriam Thompson is wondering, what can we do to reverse the danger that Trump and McConnell and the complicit Republicans are causing by flooding the judiciary with right-wing and incompetent judges?
Well, if you read me in The Nation, a couple of months ago, I wrote a story about pack the court. We have to, if the Democrats ever get control again, which will probably happen in our lifetimes, if the Democrats ever control the White House and the Senate again, we must pack the court. There are various different ways to pack the court. I support one plan. There are other plans out there. Pick your own, but we're packing the court because the idea that we should have to live under these unqualified, illegitimate Republicans for the rest of their natural lives because Mitch McConnell successfully stole a seat from Barack Obama, and because Trump and McConnell came together to promote an alleged attempted rapist, that is unacceptable to me. Yes, these justices could be impeached, but we saw how well impeachment worked for Trump. I don't think it would work any better for Kavanaugh, even though he could be impeached under the exact same process that the president was impeached under. So it's unlikely that we will be able to fire them. And so if we can't fire them, we have to diminish their influence. And the only way to diminish their influence is to pack the court. I would just add, because whenever court packing comes up, there are centrists who go, packing in the court has happened before. 9 justices was not in the Constitution. The Republicans did it first when they changed the number from 9 to 8 because a black guy nominated one. There are various ways that I can get you along. I can bring you to the court packing part of the program. I would suggest you read it in The Nation first, but that is just what we have to do. And the candidates who are not there need to get a clue. Because there is nothing, and I mean nothing, that Democrats want, whether they're centrist Democrats or liberal Democrats or progressive Democrats. There is nothing the Democrats want that will get through the Roberts Court. Nothing on climate change, nothing on guns, nothing on women's rights, nothing. Because the five...
You mute?
Sorry, am I off?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, because the 5 conservative justices will overrule or overturn any progressive or liberal policy that comes across their desk. And so sorry, just to finish, the Democrats who are not on court packing, I promise you, give them 2 years and they will come over to my side as well.
I think we have time for at least one more question. We'll see. Ann Martin.
Oh my God, it's been an hour? Jeez.
Yeah, we're getting close there. I know, right? Ann Martin is wondering if you can comment on, and you did in your opening, but how COVID-19 has a likely disproportionate impact on African Americans. And she's also seeing a parallel between how people of color are going to experience this pandemic and how they experience our criminal justice system.
Yeah, so again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a public health official, and so I am reserved when I'm talking about this issue because I do not have at the ready all of the facts necessary to make a real strong assessment of why. But we do know some basic things, right? We know that African American people are disproportionately impoverished. That affects contracting the disease and getting medical care. We know that they disproportionately don't have access to good, affordable health care. We know that they disproportionately work in service industries, which is a problem if you're trying to slow the spread. You still have to go to work if you're working in a service industry and you want to keep your job. And we know that African Americans are kind of likely to be the first ones fired from any job that they do have, which then pushes even like white collar African American workers, then pushes them to go to work, to show up at the office, to break quarantine in order to keep their job because they know that they will be the first ones fired if things go ill, right? All of that plays a role. I think there was also, so I think those are the main reasons. I think there was also for a while a feeling that this was only affecting white countries. I think that is, I mean, one of the reasons why it took longer for it to kind of show up on the maps that it was affecting countries on the African continent is because there were fewer tests on the African continent. And so we couldn't see the effects as readily as we could in Italy, where they had lots of tests, or comparatively more tests than, Namibia. But now we're seeing what happens. Now we're seeing that go through that. I do think that had a little bit of not going to be a thing that happens here. So I think there are tons of factors that all go to the fundamental racial disparity that we already have in our country. I think in general, what coronavirus is exposing, and Katrina said this in her opening, it's probably as good a place as any to close. All the virus is doing is exposing weaknesses that were already there in our system, right? It's just a stress test, and it's showing where all the cracks are. One of the things, we're talking, it's my wife's birthday, right? So we were early to have children. And we had friends who were like, oh, it seems like children have brought you guys together. I'm like, what? What single man? No, all kids do is like put pressure on your marriage and expose where the fissures are, right? Like, we happen to have a good marriage, so children like brought us closer together because like my wife and I are like the two people that we would want to be with in a foxhole. But if you don't have that kind of marriage, all the child's gonna do is be like, wow, like, I didn't realize how much I hated this person until I saw this person little. Like that's all the kid is gonna do, right? That's what coronavirus is. If you have strong systems, the coronavirus is showing you how to bring those systems together and how to bring your community together and how to fight together. But if you have weakness, if you have weak systems and weak leadership and weak government and weak healthcare, all the virus is doing is killing you. And I think that's where we are, not just with our elections, but with our society. This is a stress test, and we're seeing exactly where we fail.
Elie, thank you. I just want to say, listening to you, I understand better the purpose, the value of the nation in these times. You tell it like it is. You speak the truth. And at the Nation, we're going to be doing much more to cover so many of the issues Elie's talking about, and he will be writing, obviously, but how to protect our elections, how to protect our courts, how to protect women's rights, racial justice. Do go back and read Elie's remarkable cover story, Reform the Court. The Nation's been around so long, we were there for the fights in the 30s under Franklin Roosevelt. I was raised in a household where we were not permitted to call it packing, Elie. It was the court reform program. And I still believe that because it's about our democracy. But I will say, you know, one area where I might disagree with Elie, I do think, and my father was a politician, I do think politicians have many flaws, but I hope those on this call will join us next week. I think Elie would say Pramila Jayapal is one of those politicians today and one of those we cover often, Progressive Caucus and others, who have put forward legislation to secure our elections, which we write about so you can know about it and support it. Because as Elie says, these are times we're at home, but we can mobilize virtually. Our talk today is part of that, exposing what we need to know. Come to the Nation to find Take Action, which gives you steps you can do built around our writing and reporting, because we have to be mobilized in these times. And I think what Elie said about, you know, shaming and exposing is what the Nation does well. We also propose. We don't want you to just sit and be paralyzed. We want to make sure you have steps to take based on our great writing, our great journalists, our great columnists. So thank you so much for being part of this call. I hope you'll support us. These are tough times for all. I know everyone's stretched, but I do think that our journalism, independent, free journalism in these times is more important than ever to counter what Elie was talking, a lot of what he was describing going on in our politics. And we can't let Wisconsin be the playbook for voter suppression. We'll be covering a lot of how to counter voter suppression and how we can actually vote. If people die to secure the vote, let's make sure people don't die voting in these times. So thank you all for joining, and join us next week. And Elie, thank you so much for taking time out, and enjoy the rest of this wonderful birthday day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.